This episode of New Politics was released on the 24th of December, 2022, and produced on the land of the Wangal and Whadjuk people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, part 2 of our review on the year in politics. This week we're looking at the influence of Scott Morrison over the year and what that means for the future of Australian politics. I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, just under Scott Morrison on Santa's naughty list.
And if you'd like to support New Politics, you can support us through a Patreon subscription. But whether it's a subscription or if you just want to listen in, read our material online or buy a t-shirt or buy a book, it's all available at newpolitics.com.au, and all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
For most of this year, it looked like Scott Morrison and the Liberal National Coalition was going to lose the election, but because the opinion polls got it so wrong in 2019, very few people were prepared to predict the election result in 2022. But it was obvious that Morrison was going to use the same tactics from 2019 to try and win this election. Photo opportunities, media opportunities, and it was almost like season 2 of At Home with the Morrisons. Scott Morrison was seen as a formidable campaigner, that's what the media kept on telling us, but that was a charade and a paper tiger. Morrison was actually a hopeless campaigner and was thrown out of office at the May election. Now, we were strong critics at New Politics of Morrison during his time as Prime Minister, and that was almost 4 years, and it seems that the electorate agreed with us at the federal election result in May 2022. But with all the material and information that's coming out about Scott Morrison since that election loss, not only was he the worst Prime Minister in Australia's history, but he was on the way to becoming one of the more dangerous Prime Ministers as well.
As we trawl through the wreckage of what he did, and we had the Robodebt Royal Commission where he was interviewed last week, that he didn't come across as someone either very honest or very competent or even very politically smart. We see more and more examples of just how unfit he was for office. Now, there were those of us who had always been highly critical and who had never thought he was doing a good job, but the depth of depravity is astonishing. We can look at Shaw, the McMahon government, which was the remnants of a tired government that had been in for 23 years and that had had nothing left to say and turned to Billy McMahon reluctantly is too strong a word. We'd had the Scullin government, who was an honest government but had been overtaken by events, the Great Depression and a massive party split. I mean, we could argue where John Howard fits here, and certainly he's in the bottom half of things, but they were mostly a competent government with scandal, but not without the blatant and open corruption of the Morrison years. We have had Tony Abbott, who was really an example of the dog chasing the car. Having got it, what's he going to do with it in terms of the car being the prime ministership? And he did nothing except act like a lout, which of course allows Scott Morrison to continue the work. Turnbull, who couldn't control his party, and I've said this before, I don't think anyone could have. These are some of the worst governments in Australian history. We could point to many others, and to rank them is an interesting exercise. And what criteria you use as to worst. I know that there are some people who say that Howard's was the worst because of its long-term effects, that it leads to things like Abbott and Turnbull and Morrison. And without John Howard, that had never have happened. Of course, you have those who'd say it was the Whitlam government or the Hawke government. And that's fine too. These are arguments that will get bogged down in subjectivity and political bias. And I don't think you need to be too strong a Labor supporter or Green supporter to put the Morrison years at the very bottom. And as we go on, it just gets worse and worse as in terms of its governance.
Absolutely it does. But I think ultimately Morrison didn't offer anything to the public. And it's not just a situation here, but most of the populists on the world stage, they've gone. Donald Trump in 2020, Boris Johnson earlier this year, Jair Bolsonaro just recently in Brazil, Morrison as well. But we do have to point out that despite many of these people being voted out in elections, Boris Johnson resigned, so he didn't actually face an election in the UK. But they still ended up getting a lot of public support. You know, Bolsonaro just lost the recent election in Brazil by less than 2%. But most of Morrison's work seemed to be based on stunts and soaking up all of the media attention. But as it was with all of these other leaders, it's all based on distraction, causing chaos within the political system. And that pretty much allows donors and corporations to do their work in government. And I think the public did work Morrison out. And as people did with all of those other populist leaders in other jurisdictions that I just mentioned. So it did take a while, but eventually they got there.
There is a tendency in Australia to give them a go. One-term governments are very, very, very rare. Scullin in 29 to 31. Now, the interesting thing with Morrison is that Morrison's closest analogy is actually McMahon, in that if you read the memoirs of politicians and Liberal politicians from McMahon's time, I'm thinking of Hasluck, Don Chipp, but they all hold McMahon in contempt. Either didn't vote for him or voted for him very reluctantly. It was extraordinary at the time. We've gone into more extraordinary things here now because McMahon had been a relatively successful treasurer, at least perceived so, whereas Morrison had not been a very successful minister at all and basically used Peter Dutton to force the leadership challenge against Malcolm Turnbull and then stabbed Dutton in the back and became Prime Minister to the point where nobody quite understood what was going on.
Well, I guess the other factor is that the more we do hear about Scott Morrison, and some people have said, oh, look, give up on this guy, you're too obsessed about him. But I think the thing is that the more details that come out, the more disturbing they actually are. So there were all those revelations about those secret ministries that he did set up, and that was in collusion with the Governor-General, David Hurley, and as far as I'm concerned, his position is untenable. But Morrison secretly appointed himself into the position of treasurer as well, and all of this is pretty weird. It was almost like he was a treasurer in exile, and he was also trying to influence foreign investment decisions, and all of this was going on in secret. Now, a lot of people have asked us, well, how does someone like Vladimir Putin become so wealthy, or the Marcos family in the Philippines, the Shah of Iran or Mugabe, all of those tin pot dictators in South America and Africa? Well, this is how they actually do it. They set up all of these structures that are legal on the surface, and we have to remember that there was nothing illegal about the way that Scott Morrison set up those secret ministries, but it could have led to pilfering of state finances. And all of this still hasn't been fully explained by Scott Morrison, but I think there might be still a long way to go with all of these issues. And just last week, Scott Morrison provided that evidence at the Robo-Debt Royal Commission, and I did make a prediction a few weeks ago that Morrison would turn up to this Royal Commission. He'd blame everyone else except for himself. He'd waffle on and take responsibility for nothing, and that's exactly what happened. But his evidence showed a great disdain for people receiving social security payments, and this seemed to be guided by his religious beliefs, almost as though he had this sort of maniacal quest just to get those payments back, even if it was by extortion. But the evidence that he provided at the Royal Commission, he said that he implemented robo-debt because he wanted to save money. But it ended up costing the Commonwealth almost $2 billion, so he didn't save any money at all. And it was all based around punishing welfare recipients for no good reason at all.
It was clear that he sees society in two parts, the saved and the unsaved. And the saved will be enriched in the kingdom of heaven, and the unsaved will not be. Of course, you could look at what the Bible says, and this is a spiritual thing, but that prosperity gospel that he pushes promises riches on earth for the elect. He definitely saw himself as one of the elect, ironically, but he also wanted to make sure that the non-elect, that is, the disadvantaged, the poor, the disabled, those whose circumstances have prevented them getting the opportunities that he has had. Now, we could point to many Bible passages where Jesus says, look after the poor, look after the disadvantaged, don't judge others. Let God do the judging. You just make sure you look after everybody. That's as far as the message is, as far as I can tell. But that's not Morrison's view. Morrison is, you look after your own self-interest. Any reward you get is from God, so you must have earned it. Someone pointed out that, Jesus was a Middle Eastern Jewish immigrant with long hair, how would he do in today's churches? That's another discussion for another day, but it would be interesting to see Scott Morrison's response to that.
You're listening to New Politics. You can subscribe to us on Apple or Google Podcasts, listen through YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, and Amazon Music, or find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can also donate to New Politics through Patreon. And please share, comment, or add a review. It helps other listeners find our podcast.
Follow the sun, and which way the wind blows, when this day is done. Breathe in the air, set your intentions, dream with care. Tomorrow's a new day for everyone, a brand new moon and brand new sun.
I guess the other issue is that Morrison always used division within the community for political advantage. Morrison did this with asylum seekers, transgender issues, that whole idea that you can't have men playing women's sports. He was at war with renewable energy, with electric utes. He was at war with the weekend. He showed indifference to women's issues. You had to talk to Jen about a rape at Parliament House to work out how to respond. There was a cover-up of a rape or an alleged rape at Parliament House as well. There was all that corruption. So it looks like his biggest legacy is going to be in those trivia night questions, and you alluded to this before, David. Who is considered to be Australia's worst Prime Minister? And the answer to that question was always Billy McMahon from the early 1970s, and he's going to be replaced by Scott Morrison. So I think the entire McMahon family will be very happy about this. And McMahon, essentially, he was a bit of an incompetent fool. Tony Abbott, I guess he would have been a contender for the worst Prime Minister ever. He was just a die-hard ideological zealot. But we can see that Morrison is the worst and the most dangerous Prime Minister ever. And it probably was a year ago that we suggested that Morrison is a dangerous Prime Minister. And a lot of people said, oh, no, he's just a bit of a buffoon. He's the daggy dad and all of those sort of things. But with all the material that's coming out about Scott Morrison, and I think there's still quite a bit more to come as well, I think it's really safe to suggest that he is the worst Prime Minister and he's the most dangerous Prime Minister that we've ever had.
Yeah. Again, McMahon was somewhat hampered by his own personal failings, I guess, that he wasn't terribly competent, he wasn't perceived as being terribly honest. His colleagues saw him as being a bit pathetic. To be fair to McMahon, he still had some decent people in his cabinet. Some of them weren't quite experienced enough. Some of them had overstayed and were looking to get out, just waiting for the right opportunity, and perhaps weren't as committed to the job as they might have been 5 or 6 years earlier. It's a very hard job. I'm not really criticising them for that. Morrison had nobody who was at least competent. You had some better performers. Simon Birmingham, in probably any other government, wouldn't have become a senior member. There's a few backbenchers around who don't become ministers, who were decent, not many. But when you look at the front bench of the Morrison ministry, it is a bunch of galoots, yahoos and clowns. It's distressing that these people are allowed anywhere near to run a building. And private conversations with public servants that remain off the record say the same, that there were very few ministers who were good at the job. Now, you're always going to get that. And I'm sure over time, with the current Albanese government, there's going to be the star performers. Penny Wong, Mark Dreyfus, Tanya Plibersek is shaping up really well. But there's going to be those who, they're not so good. And in the inevitable reshuffles that happen, some will be moved out and hopefully better people will be put in. But they're not as obvious, they're not as prominent. And of course, the other thing with the Morrison years was the blatant corruption. We can drop names, and I don't actually have to say any more. Whether they were corrupt or not, and it's all alleged, of course, but the perception of corruption was there. Angus Taylor, Barnaby Joyce, Suzanne Ley, Michaelia Cash. You had that type of perception that we were dealing with a bunch of crooks, Cayman Island businesses, using travel allowance to buy units off developers, or buying the land, the third Sydney airport, for 10 times its value. None of this looks good. As I said, there may be very honest and highly ethical reasons as to why all this happened, but it's not a good look. You then just have the pure incompetence, those who you wonder how they get out of bed in the morning, let alone breathe in and out consistently. There was a lot of those. It wasn't just Morrison.
So I guess the National Anti-Corruption Commission will be able to look at all of these things, but the question about whether they could get out of bed by themselves or whether they knew how to breathe in and out or not, that's probably another body that can look into that, not the National Anti-Corruption Commission. But there were also some other issues throughout this big year in politics. The Bruce Lerman trial had to be abandoned, and it seems like there was a lot of interference from the Australian Federal Police there, and it seems like there might be more material that needs to be investigated there. The Voice to Parliament, that's also been put into the political circle as promised by Anthony Albanese. There's still a long way to go on this. There's a referendum that is planned towards the end of next year. But the progress, I guess, at this stage is going as well as could be expected. There's the relationship with Pacific Islands and China that are in the process of being repaired there as well, and that's got some way to go as well. Julian Assange is still in jail and he needs to get out of jail. The case against the whistleblower Richard Boyle is still going on, and that's a case that needs to be dropped. We also had the state elections in Victoria and South Australia, so it's hard to keep a track on everything that was going on within politics, but I think we managed to go through all the big points that occurred in 2022, and we'll be looking at those big issues again in 2023.
We also had the change of a head of state, death of the Queen. It has been business as usual, which is how the system's been set up for 400 years or thereabouts, that the Queen dies and her successor in this case, or the monarch dies and her successor in this case replaces. But there's been very little talk of it in Australia apart from an extremely long grieving process, which included a public holiday that strangely in Australia didn't go down as well as perhaps most public holidays do, for good reasons. Medical people said, well, we've had all these appointments booked that are vital and we can't really reschedule them, and we can't afford to pay shift penalties to workers. Casual workers suddenly found that they'd lost a day's income because, again, employers' reluctance to pay shift penalties, whether rightly or wrongly, is a debate for another day. And we haven't heard very much from the Republicans either. Like, it was always assumed that once the Queen passed, we would start to move towards a republic. Now, admittedly, the government is focusing on the voice to Parliament, which is an important thing. You would think that it's been this extremely divisive thing amongst the Indigenous community because the mainstream media have found Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine are opposed to it. But we have found that the government consulted with 250 elders who all represented their community and got broad agreement on what it should be. And that will be something that will fire up passions over the next year till the referendum happens.
So that's it for the New Politics podcast, not just for this episode, but for the whole year as well. Everyone needs to have a break at this time of the year, and we'll have a short break as well. And David, it's been a good year for New Politics. We've now got around 30,000 listeners. We've just published our new book. T-shirt sales and merchandise are going well, and it doesn't matter what the circumstances are, all the criticism and attacks that we get, mainly from right-wingers. Sometimes it comes from the left wing as well. This year we've produced a program from Sydney, from Perth, from Dubbo, from a telephone box, from hotel quarantine, from a hospital. Sometimes, David, you and I are in the same room together. Most times we're not. When there's a flood or whether we receive defamation notices, and a big hello to George Christensen if he's listening out there. I've got a broken nose at the moment, but whatever the case is, we still produce each episode and get it out there to our listeners. And thanks to everyone that's listened in to us this year and all of our Patreon subscribers. And without listeners and without subscribers, there's no podcast. And I know that you can still produce it, but it's not much fun if no one's listening in.
Yeah, exactly. And it's been an absolute pleasure. I love the debates that our listeners bring in. Sometimes I wonder where they're coming from, but that's okay. I'm maybe missing something. I have thoroughly enjoyed engaging with you, Eddie,
And I enjoy engaging with you too, David.
and I'm looking forward to many more years of this.
So that's all done now. 2022 is all over. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. Happy Christmas to everyone. All the very best for the new year, and we'll see you next time.